So there's the function argument. Okay, so that is the sort of setup. We've seen Aristotle's theory of the good life, Aristotle's theory of, and I indicated that the conclusion of the function argument is pointing us toward moral virtue. This idea of reason operating on moderating the emotions. And so this brings us to, in order to really get a better picture of what a life spent doing the activity of the soul that involves reason, in order to get a better picture of exactly what that looks like, we need to know what is a virtue for Aristotle, and more generally, how should we think of a virtue? And that will give us a better sense of exactly what it is that, if you like Aristotle's view, you're going to need to do to, if he's right, achieve happiness. So we can think of a moral virtue as a habit or a disposition which has been intentionally developed. So it's not an accident, and it's not something you're born with either. Something you have to, using your reason and using sort of life planning, intentionally cultivate this habit or disposition. And it's not a habit of like, whether or not you bite your nails, or which side of the placemat you put your fork or knife or something. Those aren't the kinds of habits that virtues are. Those are non-moral or non-virtue habits. The habits that are virtues are dispositions or habits to feel the right emotions and feel the right desires at the right times and in the right amounts, and then to act accordingly. You have to have both. Feel the right emotions and desires at the right times, in the right amounts, and act accordingly. That's pretty abstract, but it gives us something more specific here. Virtue is this using reason to develop these habits of feeling and acting. Here's an example. I didn't assign this in the reading. I may post as an optional, something optional to read a passage from later on. But to give you a sense of what virtues look like for Aristotle, we can use as an example the virtue of courage. Each virtue and vice for Aristotle has like a distinctive emotional domain. So for any emotion, anger, fear, sadness, joy, there should be a sort of corresponding virtue. In the case of fear, you can think of the domain of fear as consisting in a long continuum, where at the one extreme is an excess amount of fear, and then at the other extreme is a deficient amount of fear. Somewhere in the middle, it's not going to be numerical. Aristotle makes a big point of this later, but roughly somewhere in the middle is going to be the mean, the right amount of fear, neither a deficient amount nor an excessive amount for the circumstances. The virtue of courage for Aristotle is the habit or disposition of feeling the mean amount of courage in the appropriate circumstances. And then there are two different ways of going wrong with respect to fear, two different habits that one could form that would be vices of fear. The vice of cowardice is the habit of feeling too little or too much fear, either feeling too much fear for something that is not worthy of fear, or alternatively feeling the right amount but not letting your action appropriately match up with the amount of fear you're feeling. If you feel the same amount of fear on the battlefield as the person standing next to you, but he or she is able to grit his or her teeth and march onward, and you drop your weapons and run, that's for Aristotle also going to be a kind of cowardice. But in general, it's ratchet up the amount of the emotion felt, and you get one kind of vice, and ratchet it down and you get a different kind of vice. So if you feel I think I set up this this chart wrong. Sorry, you should flip those. So the vice of excess fear should be cowardice, and the vice of deficient amount of fear should be brashness. So sorry about that. But the point is, too much fear is a vice. Too little fear is also a vice, and in between is courage. So we've just mentioned courage. Temperance and generosity are two other Aristotelian virtues. He also talks about justice and injustice as virtues, and there are some other examples, but these are some. And once again, these should be flipped. I think the excess and deficiency. These are some examples for Aristotle. Okay, so we have just gone through some of the basics of Aristotle's theory of the good life, and we've seen some ways in which it interacts with and contrasts with hedonism. I want to just end with a few philosophical questions that are worth contemplating for your own sake and also for the sake of understanding Aristotle better. First, do you agree with Aristotle that human beings have a function? He's a little hesitant to say this at first. He says if humans have a function, then that's going to be relevant to the good life. But he never really gives us an argument for the claim that we do have a function. He just kind of says, wouldn't it be weird if everything else did, but we didn't? But, modern biology tells us that we are evolved beings. And although biology doesn't tell us that there's no God, if you're someone who doesn't believe in a designer who sort of guided the evolutionary process, why think that human beings have a function in the way that chairs do? Chairs have a function because they were made to be sat on by people. But people weren't made to think by other people. We weren't made for any purpose on some views. So if you don't believe in God or a designer, can you still agree with Aristotle that human beings have a function? I will say that is an open question. There are some people who think that the idea of natural teleology, as it's sometimes called, is incoherent, whereas there are other atheists and agnostics who say, look, nature is sort of built with functions. Every natural kind has a corresponding function. It didn't have to be put there by a god. So that's sort of something interesting to contemplate. And then the second follow-up question is, suppose that human beings do have a function, as Aristotle claims. Is he right about what our functions are? Does he emphasize reason too much, perhaps to the exclusion of some other traits that are distinctive of human beings? Somebody in one of the, I think, second sections brought up the thought that we really aren't as reasonable or rational as Aristotle seems to think. He certainly doesn't think that we are born fulfilling our function. That's why we have to work at it. But he does seem to think that it's possible for most of us. And someone was raising doubts about that. They were like, I don't think that anyone really ever actually acts on reason. And I'm not even sure people are capable of using their reason. That would be a problem for Aristotle if that was true. Slightly longer question. Aristotle's theory of welfare really neatly explains why we don't want to plug into the experience machine. We'd be missing out on real moral virtue. We'd be getting just one little bit of intrinsic value, which is the pleasure, to the exclusion of the other things that are intrinsically good. We also, though, we do want pleasure, right? The good experiences in the experience machine are good and desirable, and it's tempting. There's a concern that Aristotle may go too far in the other direction, that what he may be proposing is the life of virtue, may be almost inevitably like just a painful life, really hard to become virtuous. And often people who manage to live virtuous lives, the examples I gave earlier, end up being hated by their society, in part because they are morally superior and they're calling people in their society to live up to their standards, and people don't like to be called out for hypocrisy. And this is why Socrates was killed. Has Aristotle gone too far away from pleasure? And is his suggestion amounting to the good life is one of toil and giving up of the self for the other? Is that just an unattractive picture of the good life at the end of the day? Something to think about.